Today I've brought the chapter Interview by Christopher Sylvester for class 12. So quickly I'll be taking up the chapter because I know your exams are approaching, so you wanted me to do this chapter. So here is the chapter. Now, first of all, meaning as given in Wikipedia. So, what is an interview actually? So, an interview is a structured conversation. Now, this word structured is very important here. So, it is a structured conversation where one participant asks question and the other provides answers. So, it means the participant who is asking questions, he has those questions pre-planned. So, therefore, it's a structured conversation. Maybe the answers they are not pre-planned, obviously. So, but the questions they are pre-planned. So, in common parlance, the word interview it refers to one-on-one conversation between an interviewer and an interviewee. The interviewer asks questions to which the interviewer responds, usually providing information. That information may be used or provided to other audiences immediately or later. So that interview, the information that is gathered from the interview, it is used or it is provided to other audiences. Other audiences, now suppose it is a live interview, so immediately it is provided, it reaches the audiences, or later maybe it gets published in a newspaper or a journal or a magazine. Now, let's talk about the author. The author, Christopher Sylvester, 1959, he was a student of history at Peterhouse, Cambridge. He was a reporter, for a Private Eye. For 10 years, he's worked as a reporter there and has written features for Vanity Fair. So it means that he has taken many interviews during his span of service. So, therefore, this chapter that we are going to read, so the following, that means this chapter, it is an excerpt taken from his introduction to the Penguin Book of Interviews. Now, let's begin. What is there in part one? So, this chapter, it is divided into two parts. The first part, now, here in the beginning, the author quotes that interview, it has been a very common practice in journalism. So, since he belongs to the field of journalism. So he's talking about that. So he says it has been a very common practice in journalism since its inception that dates back to more than 130 years ago. So I would like to change the color, here, so that it is visible. Yeah. So he says that it dates back to more than 130 years ago. According to him, almost everyone who is literate will have read an interview at some point of his time, and perhaps many they are influenced by interviews. Also, he talks about many celebrities who have been interviewed over the years and lot many for a number of times. So there are many celebrities who are interviewed again and again. So when so many people they are involved, opinions about interview as a medium they are going to differ. So when interviews they are taken of celebrities or maybe there are athletes and other people from different different services and different jobs, different professions. So the opinions about interviews they're going to vary. So for some, he talks about that some have an extravagant claim about interview. For them, it is in its highest form or source of truth. And for some, it is an art. Then he says that there are certain celebrities who find themselves to be victims. So they find that interviews they are not good. They find that they become a victim. So many despise. Despise here it means they hate, they dislike, they scorn being interviewed. So he many despise it as an unwarranted intrusion. Now, what is this unwarranted intrusion? It is unjustified breach into their lives. So बहुत से celebrities हैं उनको लगता है कि इंटरव्यू के कारण उनकी जो privacy है that actually it is there's a breach in their privacy. Now some feel it diminishes them. Now what is it this diminishes them? It so maybe they feel that their stature, their true stature, it is not revealed. So that is why many they don't like giving an interview. So then he gives a rather very interesting example of some primitive culture where it is believed that if one takes a photographic portrait of somebody, then one is stealing that person's soul. Now, this is very interesting. So, there are cultures. So, they feel that if a photograph is taken, a photographic portrait here, maybe the camera steals the soul of the person. And with that, so such a notion, it is based on the belief that one can then command them to do anything or can cause any harm to that photograph portrait that is taken. So this is belief in many primitive cultures. So obviously educated people they may not believe it, or they call it superstition, but many they believe this. Then he quotes certain celebrities expressing their views on interviews. So when he says that many celebrities they despise the heat, so he also quotes certain celebrities who don't like being interviewed or their different opinions about interviews. So one by one, I have quoted all those, and you need to remember these. So V.S. Naipaul, the first one, he feels that some people they are wounded by interviews and lose a part of themselves. Now, lose a part of themselves means maybe very personal questions they are asked. So V.S. Naipaul is of this view. Then comes Lewis Carroll. So he says he is the creator of Alice in Wonderland. So he was said to have just had just a horror of the interviewer, and he never consented to be interviewed. It was his horror of being lionized. Now, this is very important, being lionized. So Lewis Carroll, he says that he was said to have had a just horror of the interviewer. Now, lionized here means to treat as a celebrity, to give a lot of public attention. So, which made him thus repel would be acquaintances, interviewers, and the persistent petitioners for his autograph. And he would afterwards relate the stories of his success in silencing all such people with much satisfaction and amusement. Now, what it means? Now, he felt that interviewers, so or if he gives an interview, so he would come into a lot of public attention, he would gain a lot of public attention, which he didn't want. So therefore he even avoided acquaintances or interviewers or even people who were after him for an autograph. And afterwards he would tell other people the stories or his victory and his success, that how he was able to shun away these people. So, with much satisfaction and amusement. So, Lewis Carroll avoided every kind of approach, whether the approach was for taking an interview, whether an approach was for an autograph. So, he avoided all such approaches. So, next one now is Rudyard Kipling. Now, he was also very critical about the attitude of interviewers. His wife Caroline writes in her diary for 14th October 1892. So, you can see the year quite long back. So 1892, that their day was wrecked by two reporters from Boston. So wrecked, it is a very harsh word. So she writes in a diary that their day was wrecked by two reporters from Boston. She reports her husband saying to the reporters, "Why do I refuse to be interviewed?" So the husband was very angry, and he told the interviewers that, do you want to know that why I refuse to be interviewed? So he said because it is immoral. So Rudyard Kipling felt that interview it was immoral. It is a crime, just as much of a crime as an offense against my person. Sorry, it should be, I think, any person, as an assault, and just as much merits punishment. So he was of the view that taking an interview, it was a crime. So the person, the interviewer, he was actually assaulting the interview. So as there is a punishment for an assault, there's a law that if someone assaults, so that person should be punished. So similarly, he says that the person who takes an interview should also be punished. So it is cowardly and vile. So here he wants to say it's unpleasant and it is foul to take an interview. So no respectable man would ask it, much less give it. So he says both ways. No respectable man actually would approach anyone to get an interview, and similarly, on the other hand, no respectable person would agree to give an interview. So this were the views of Rudyard Kipling. But then we come to know that look how Kipling, he was contradicting himself, as he himself had interviewed Mark Twain only a few years back. So the year he is giving this statement, only a few years back he had interviewed Mark Twain. So these celebrities, you never know what they're going to do. Okay, then we come to H.G. Wells. So in an interview in 1894, Refer to the interviewing ordeal. So again, he says, interviewing ordeal. So a very difficult time. So unpleasant experience or a trauma or a testing experience. But was a fairly frequent interviewee and for 40 years later found himself interviewing Joseph Stalin. So again, he said that being interviewed, it was an unpleasant experience, it was a trauma, it was a testing experience. But then he was a fairly frequent interviewer. He gave a number of interviews, and 40 years later, he found himself interviewing Joseph Stalin. Then, fifth one is Saul Bellow, who has consented to be interviewed on several occasions. Nevertheless, he once described interviews as being like thumbprints on his windpipe. Now, again, this is a very harsh statement. Thumbprints, sorry, on his windpipe. So I've explained what it means in the question. So later on. Now, Dennis Bryan, he has written, almost everything of moment reaches us through one man asking questions of another. So, as interview, mostly it is one on one. So, he says that most of the information that reaches people, it is through one man asking questions of another. So, because of this, the interviewer holds a position of unprecedented power and influence. Now, this statement also I have explained in the question later. So, you can, what is the explanation? You can see that later. Now let's move on to the next part. But then the author says that whatever the case may be, there are certain advantages or positive points of interview. So this can even come as a question. So why interview as a genre has become commonplace in journalism? It is because of these merits, these advantages. So what are the advantages? First is that it is supremely serviceable. Serviceable here means useful medium of communication. So that too in journalism. So very useful medium of communication. And we get a very vivid here means realistic and detailed impression of our contemporaries through interviews. So when we are interviewing people, so we get a lot of information. The information that biographies and autobiographies provide us through voluminous books, an interview conveys it to us in a lesser time and that too in an interesting and intriguing manner. So that information, maybe we can read the biography or autobiography of that person, of that celebrity, but it is like you have to go through the whole book. But for the interview, it's an interesting and you can read it short and crisp. So it becomes very intriguing. Then it is an art also, as previously I told you that the author believes that it is an art also. So it precisely brings out the true self of the interviewee. So this true self, it is actually based on the questions that the interview asks. So it is probably the art of questioning of the interviewer also. Then, according to some, it is in its highest form a source of truth, as we read it previously. So these are the advantages of interview. So again, it can be asked as a question. Now, these are a few important questions from the first part. Why do most of the celebrities do not want to be interviewed? So most of the celebrities, they avoid being interviewed because they think it's to be an unnecessary intrusion into their lives. Interviews seem to diminish their stature and they find themselves to be victims. So here you can give examples of any two, one or three celebrities. What are their views? Like I have taken V.S. Naipaul. He feels that some people, they are wounded by interviews and they lose a part of themselves. And Rudyard Kipling, he goes to the extent of calling it as an immoral offense, a crime which warrants punishment. Then explain the expression thumbprints on his windpipe as described by Saul Bellow. Now, Saul Bellow has been interviewed on several occasions, but he describes interviews as something that strangulates his throat here, the windpipe, and suffocates him. So the questions sometimes they can be so private, maybe so personal, that he felt suffocated. He didn't want to give answers, but then at that time he was in a tight place. So he wants to say that the interviewer exerts so much pressure on the interview with his questions, sometimes too personal, that he feels choked and uneasy. So this is the meaning of the phrase thumbprints on his windpipe. Now the next one. The interviewer has unprecedented power and influence over the interview discussed. Dennis Bryan believes that the interview holds the power during the interview. He has the ability to obtain answers to any questions he desires. He has the capacity to put the interviewee in an awkward position. He also serves as a resource of knowledge that readers and viewers can use, which increases his influence over the interview. As a result, Dennis Bryan puts an interview on a pedestal. The interviewer consequently has unmatched authority and influence over the interviewee during the interview. So, according to this, जो interviewee है उस time पे interviewer की mercy पे होता है. So this is what actually it means. Now we move on to the second part. So part 2, what is there in part 2? It is an extract from an interview of Umberto Eco. The interviewer is Mukund Padmanabhan from The Hindu, so a reporter, the Hindu newspaper. Umberto Eco, a professor at the University of Bologna in Italy, had already acquired a formidable here means great, impressive, a seasoned reputation as a scholar for his ideas on semiotics. Semiotics is study of science, literary interpretation, and medieval aesthetics before he turned to writing fiction. Literary fiction, then academic text, essays, children books, newspaper articles. His written output is staggeringly large. So, staggeringly here, it means high in number and wide ranging also. So, in 1980, he acquired the equivalent of intellectual superstardom with the publication of The Name of the Rose. So, that is, Name of the Rose is his novel, which sold more than 10 million copies. So, now we'll be reading with this background. We are going to read his interview. Again, I would like to change the color here. Yeah. So the interview between Mukund, he's taking the interview of Umberto Eco. So Mukund, he asks his first question. He says that, what do you have to say about what David Lodge remarked? I can't understand how one man can do all the things he does. Now, he here is Umberto. So Umberto, he answers that, well, I may give the impression of doing many things, but in the end, I'm always doing the same thing. So Umberto, with this answer, he confuses Mukund. So Mukund, he is a little perplexed. So Umberto's answer seems to be weird to him. So he asks that which is? Which is, I means like you are doing the same thing. So what same thing? So he wants to know which same thing he's talking about. So since his writing, it was so wide ranging. So he's written articles, his children books, he's written essays. So such wide ranging literary work. Therefore, David Lodge, he remarked that he cannot understand that how one man can do all this. So he answers that this would be difficult to explain. I have some philosophical interests and pursue them through my academic work and my novels. Now, what he means by philosophical interests here, so he means that he has certain vision for life, there are certain ethics and attitude which guides him. And this can be seen in his work also. So certain principles are there, certain ethics are there, and all his work, so they are based on that. And therefore, he says that actually I am doing the same thing, but others they get impression that all those things they are different. So he says even my books for children they are about non-violence and peace. So the same bunch of ethical philosophical interests you see. So and then he shares something very interesting. So I hope that now this is clear. So why he says that it may seem to be different or wide ranging to other people, but for me it's the same thing. So he says that, and then I have a secret. Now this secret is interesting. He says that, did you know what will happen if you eliminate the empty spaces from the universe? Eliminate the empty spaces in all the atoms. So, what is going to happen? The universe will become a size of my fist. Similarly, he says we have a lot of empty spaces in our lives. So, these empty spaces are very important for him. He says that I call them interstices. Say you are coming over to my place. You are in an elevator, and while you are coming up, I am waiting for you. Now, this is an interstice, an empty space, and I work in empty spaces. This is important. Remember, I work in empty spaces. While waiting for your elevator to come up from the first to the third floor, I have already written an article, and he laughs. Now, this is very interesting. Even when I thought I'm also doing many things in the empty spaces, which he calls interstices, like suppose I'm giving an invigilation duty. So at that time, I plan for the question paper. Maybe I plan for the next test that I have to take. So that is, I'm also working in interstices, the empty spaces. Okay, so now next what he says. So Mukund to this says that not everyone can do that, of course. So your non-fictional writing, your scholarly work has a certain playful and personal quality about it. It is marked departure from the regular academic style. Now, this is again an important question. So, it is a marked departure from the regular academic style, which is invariably depersonalized and often dry and boring. So, the regular academic style, it is very boring, it's depersonalized, very dry. But Amberto's academic work also, it has a certain playfulness in it. So he says that he asked them that have you consciously adopted an informal approach or is it something that just came naturally to you? So to this, Ambato says that when I presented my first doctoral dissertation in Italy, one of the professors said, scholars, they learn a lot of a certain subject, then they make a lot of false hypotheses, then they correct them, and at the end they put the conclusion. So he says that the usual way how scholars they present their dissertation is that they research a lot about the subject, then certain things they add, a lot of false hypotheses they make, and then they correct them, and then they conclude in the end. But he says that you, on the contrary, you've told a story about your research and you've even included your trials and errors. So at the same time, he recognized I was right and went on to publish my dissertation as a book. So Ambato says that since he published my dissertation as a book, it meant that he had liked it. So Ambato understood that this is how I have to write my scholarly papers. So this is the question. So according to the general belief, academic writing is invariably depersonalized and often dry and boring. So how is Ambato's writing different from it? So this is what I've explained just now. So this is the answer to this important question. So then he says that at that point, at the age of 22, he says that I understood that scholarly books should be written that way, that I had done, by telling a story of the research. So he says that since my scholarly, my academic work also, it has a certain narrative part. So it also tells a story. So he didn't feel the need to write novels. So he says that this is why my essays always have a narrative aspect. And this is why probably I started writing narratives, that is, novels, he says, that so late. Maybe it was, he says, at the age of 50, more or less. So, why did Ambato take to writing novels so late? That is the next important question. So, that is already answered. Now, next. Then he says that I remember that my dear friend Ronald Barthes, he was always frustrated that he was an essayist, but he wanted to be a novelist. So he wanted to do creative writing one day or another, but he died before he could do so. But Ambato says that I never felt this kind of frustration because his academic, his scholarly work had that touch. So he says that I started writing novels by accident. He says one day I didn't have anything to do, so I started. Novels probably satisfied his taste for narration. So then Mukund asked that talking about novels, from being a famous academic, you went on to becoming a spectacularly famous after the publication of The Name of the Rose. That is the name of his novel. So he says you've written 5 novels, as against many more scholarly works of non-fiction, at least more than 20 of them. So Mukund says that you've written just 5 novels, whereas your other work, non-fiction work, it is more than 20. So Ambato corrects him and says that it is over 40. So Mukund says, okay, over 40, and among them a seminal piece of work on semiotics. So seminal here means groundbreaking, pioneering. On semiotics. So semiotics, I've already told you, it's the study of signs and symbols and their use and interpretation. But he says that if you ask most of the people about Umberto Eco, and they will say, oh, he's a novelist. So therefore, Mukund says that does that bother you because you've just written 5 novels and major portion it is your scholarly academic work. So let's see what Umberto says. He says, yes, because I consider myself a university professor. So he considers himself a university professor who writes novels on Sunday. So this can also come as an important question. So elucidate that He considers himself a university professor who writes novels on Sundays. So he says that this is not a joke. I participate in academic conferences and not in meetings of pen clubs and writers. I identify myself with academic community. But then he says it is okay if most of the people they have read only novels. So they consider him as a novelist. I know that by writing novels I reach larger audience. So this is another aspect. Because novels they have a larger audience, whereas academic work it is limited. Scholarly work it's limited to universities maybe. So he says that I cannot expect to have 1 million readers with stuff on semiotics. So Ambato was bothered by the fact that people recognized him as a novelist while he considered himself as an academician. So elucidate. So again, a question. Then he says that, which brings me to my next question. The Name of the Rose is a very serious novel. So now Mukund is asking about the novel. It has a detective yarn at one level, but it also delves into metaphysics, theology, and medieval history. Yet it enjoyed a huge mass audience. So were you puzzled at all by this? So delve here means to research deeply, to inquire. So that novel delves into metaphysics. What is metaphysics? It is a part of philosophy that is about understanding existence and knowledge. And theology, it is a study of nature of God and religious belief. So another question, what were the reasons for the success of The Name of the Rose? So let's see what Ambato has to say about it. So he says that no, I was not like confused or perplexed, but journalists were puzzled. So he says that sometimes even publishers. And this is because journalists and publishers they believe that people like trash. So he feels that it is the belief of journalists and publishers that people they like trash. They don't like difficult reading. Consider there are 6 billion people on this planet. The Name of the Rose sold between 10 to 15 million copies, and he says that in this way I have reached only a small percentage of readers. But it is exactly these kind of readers who don't want easy experiences. So he wants to say that it is a general belief that people they like trash. They don't like serious reading. They don't like difficult reading experiences, but it is wrong. So he says that the 10 to 15 million copies that have been sold, it shows that these people, they love such type of writing. So then he says, or at least they don't always want this. So maybe they don't always want it. I myself, he says, he gives his own example that at 9 p.m. after dinner, watch television and wants to see Miami Vice or The Emergency Room. So he says, I enjoy it, I need it. But then he says, I don't watch it the whole day. So similarly, he says that people, they'll be reading easy writing or leisure writing, but then they also like this kind of work. Could the huge success of the novel have anything to do with the fact that it dealt with a period of medieval history that, so his next question, Mukund, that because it also has touch of medieval history. So he asked that maybe the success is due to this. But Ambato says that that's possible. But let me tell you another story because I often tell stories like a Chinese wise man. So like a Chinese wise man, he wants to say because wise people. So it is said that they're great Chinese proverbs or stories. So he says, like a Chinese man, I also tell stories. So my American publisher said while she loved my book, she didn't expect to sell more than 3,000 copies in a country where nobody has seen a cathedral or studies Latin. But contrary to this, he says that my novel it sold over 2 to 3 million copies only in the US. So he says that because this was the belief of my publisher, he was given an advance of for only 3,000 copies. But in the end, it sold 2 or 3 million in the US. A lot of books have been written about medieval past far before mine. So he says that a lot of books have been written about medieval history. I think the success of the book is a mystery. Nobody can predict it. I think if I had written The Name of the Rose 10 years earlier, or maybe 10 years later, it wouldn't have been the same. So why it worked at that time is a mystery. So he himself is not sure that why it clicked the audience at that time. So he says that medieval history it has been touched by many other writers and authors in many other books. So why my book, it was a success, it's a mystery. And he also says that maybe it was the time or I touched the right chord, because if I had written this book maybe 10 years later or 10 years before, maybe it wouldn't have worked that way. So why it worked at that time is a mystery. So this is the interview. And now I have a certain important questions. So this is question number 4. Ambato was bothered by the fact that people recognized him as a novelist while he considered himself to be an academician. So elucidate, or people consider Ambato as a novelist. So did he like to be identified as a novelist or not? So he says that though people considered him as a novelist, he identified himself as an academician. He presented his first doctoral dissertation in Italy at the age of 22, in which he had told the story of his research. Since it was appreciated, his scholarly work, like essays, always had a narrative aspect. Therefore, he never had the urge of writing a novel separately. So when he eventually wrote a novel, it was very late at the age of 50, and that too by accident. As he himself said, that he started a novel one day when he didn't have anything to do. Also, as compared to over 40 scholarly works of non-fiction, he has written just 5 novels, which also goes in favor of him being considered as an academician. The whole week, he says that he's busy with his university work. He writes novels only on Sundays. He participates in academic conferences rather than meetings of pen clubs and writers. He identifies himself more with the academic community. Abado feels that academic papers and essays they are limited to people with scholarly interest. They are meant for academicians, those in universities and colleges, and the like. But reach of the novel is vast. It has a large audience. He said that he couldn't expect 1 million people reading his stuff on semiotics. For this reason, people they consider him novelist as they haven't read his academic articles. But he was an academician by heart. Now the next question. According to general belief, academic writing is invariably depersonalized and often dry and boring. So how is Umberto Eco's writing different from? Academic writing is invariably depersonalized and often dull, dry, and boring. However, Umberto Eco's scholarly work tells a story in an informal and playful style. He narrates the journey of his research, including his trials and errors. This provides an authentic and personal touch to his work while maintaining its creativity. So it makes the piece informative as well as interesting to read. So therefore, there is a playfulness in his writing. The last question now, what is the reason for huge success of the novel The Name of the Rose? The novel The Name of the Rose is a detective story that delves into metaphysics, theology, and medieval history. Perhaps this unconventionality of the subject is what intrigued the readers. Also, the time when it was written and reached people was that was the most appropriate, as they enjoyed reading it in spite of its difficult and serious subject. Its huge success had led many journalists and publishers perplexed, as they believed that people like trash and don't like difficult reading experiences. Even Ambato's American publisher felt that only 3,000 copies of the book would be sold in the US, as nobody had seen a cathedral there or studied later. But it sold 2 or 3 million copies in the US. Thus, the exact reason of the success is a mystery, but maybe it was the unconventionality of the subject that had intrigued the people. So, these are the important questions from the interview. I hope that you've understood the chapter and the important questions. Now you can go through the chapter, you can revise the questions, and be prepared for your approaching exams. So, bye for now. Before going, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Happy preparation.